All right. Good evening and welcome to class, everyone. Those who are watching this recording at another time, we're thankful that you're doing that. We're going to begin our reflections this evening with 1 Samuel chapter 29. We pick up having finished chapter 28 last time, and we left Saul kind of at the end of his rope, so to speak. He has gone to seek a word from the prophet Samuel via a what is it, a witch or whatever your translation might read or render that person as being someone who believed that she could contact spirits or at least try to make other people believe that. She, through obviously the Lord's help, was able to actually do something this time. And Saul's been given the very firm message that he is going to meet his end when battle commences on the following day. And so in the meantime, the Philistine soldiers are lining up, and amongst them, surprisingly, is David. So as we jump into the text here. In the first couple of verses, the Philistine armies are again lining up in formation for battle against Israel. David finds himself and his forces with Achish. Achish is the guy that David has kind of put himself under during this sort of exile period in Philistia. And so he's there preparing himself and his people to do battle against the Israelites. Now, he has, up until this point, not been attacking the Israelites, though he's told Achish that. He has been raiding the various other Gentile nations around the Philistines and bringing their goods back to his town that he was granted by Achish, Ziklag, which we're going to find out a little bit more in the next chapter. And then also giving the share of the spoil to Achish, and telling them it's come from the people of Israel when it hasn't. So there's some odd things about that. And then this whole chapter kind of reads even more oddly when you think about, well, what's David really about to do here? And we'll talk about it in a second once we kind of flesh out what the text says. So in verse 3, the Philistine leaders question Achish about David's presence. What's this guy doing here? We've heard about him. And so the Philistines had heard about the man who killed Goliath as much as the Israelites proclaimed that story. The Philistines did the same. And so even though Achish vouches for him, they still tell Achish to send David away. We don't want, even if he is at odds with Saul, in all likelihood, he'll use this as an opportunity to get himself some Philistine heads and, go back to his leader. What better way to mend bridges than to present, the evidence that you've killed some of your former master's enemies is how they're looking at it. Achish tells David that he must leave, but he pays him some pretty high compliments in doing so. And so in chapter 29, verses 6 and 7, Achish says, "Surely as the Lord lives, you have been upright, and you're going out and you're coming in with me," which is idiomatic. Going out and coming in, you're being, having fellowship and doing stuff with me has been good in my sight. And so, and further, for to this day I have not found evil in you since this day, the day of your coming to me. Nevertheless, the Lord do not favor you, and so you have to return. So we're going to examine the phrase "as the Lord lives." What did I do here? Must have copied that twice. There we go. The "as the Lord lives." So what's going on with this phrase? A couple possibilities are presented, both some things you'll see in commentaries, and then maybe a thought of my own in here. I think this could be edited for the sake of readers. It could be that he actually said, "as Dagon lives," but the inspired writer, for the sake of the Israelites reading it, didn't want that to be associated with David, or didn't want the readers to have to struggle with this, king having, made such a, blatant blasphemy, there. I don't know. That is probably one of the weaker ways of looking at it, but that's certainly a possibility. It could be that he is swearing by David's God accommodatively. David maybe has owned his service to Yahweh up to this point, because that's again the word that Achish uses, capital Lord, as indicative of Yahweh being behind the translation there. And so maybe swearing by David's God for the sake of David. It could be number three, that David has had a really profound influence on Achish. That maybe there is there's even been some talk of this God, and when you see the Israelites going abroad, they're supposed to be evangelistic. That was God's design for them, and that's even one of the Psalms, which again, so many of those are supposedly written by David. So the idea would not maybe have been far from him that he's supposed to talk about God to people. But then number four, maybe Yahweh is not exclusive at this point. There are indications archaeologically that the word was kind of adopted outside of Israel, and as much as inside Israel, you see the Baal or Baal or whatever, you see that kind of coming into their vernacular and being used by them. Could be that this is kind of flowing out the other way, and there's all kinds of things that you see out there. I remember seeing one archaeological inscription. I was trying to find it. I was actually trying to find a video that one of our brethren had produced that talked about that, and I'm kind of getting mixed up whether I heard it in a sermon or I heard it in. Have you seen Bible Land Passages? You know what that we had. Have you seen that before?
The name sounds familiar. I need to see it to update my memory.
So Bible Land Passages is a series of devotional videos done in the Holy Lands by some brothers working kind of in conjunction with the World Video Bible School, and but it's kind of its own thing too. You can just go to BibleLandPassages.org, and but I think it was one of the speakers. I heard one of the speakers do further talks on the Bible Lands where he talked about the archaeological discovery. And I'd seen this in I think Kirshner's book that I've recommended in this class before talks about this too. But these inscriptions and things that say things like here's Yahweh and his wife, like that's like, well, well, clearly either that's the Israelites messing up or it's the Gentiles adopting what they don't really understand here. And that's possible too. So I don't know which one of those four is true, but I find it interesting that he says that. And so a bit more time than probably I should have on that. David, he does want to know why he can't fight with Achish, and he's told it's not his fault. He has to leave, and he does, and that's how the chapter comes to an end. The question, I guess you're kind of my question man for today because we don't have a good group discussion, group here. So what are we meant to make of David's words? What do you think David would have done if he'd marched into battle?
Find where it specifically has David's what he says in kind of defense of himself there.
He's up. It seems like he's upset. Verse 8. But what have I done? And to this day, what have you found in your servant as long as I've been with you, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?
Yeah, I find it unlikely here that he's really intending to go and fight against Saul, just because everything we've seen from him,
previous behavior.
Yeah, his chances to kill Saul personally, he's obviously had quite, has some quite
he has been to put some distance between that prior behavior and this. I mean, this is like a year and a half later now.
Yeah, but
what mentally
it seems to be a pattern, and then the
you know.
ongoing his current thing where he is deceptive towards Achish about whether or not he's willing to be hostile towards Israel or Saul's people or Saul himself, however you want to do it. Which in a lot of ways you can say, king equals country in a lot of ways. To attack the people of Israel would be to attack Saul, and vice versa to a certain degree, depending on the take on the king. So yeah, I obviously, this is playing a little bit of what ifs since he's not allowed to go out onto the field here.
Yeah.
But my gut instinct is that he would have either found a way to avoid actually fighting the people of Israel or actually turned against the Philistines in some way, shape, or form. perhaps not against Achish himself, who he seems to have a relatively good relationship, but perhaps he would have found a way to leave, one of the other kings open to attack or something
Mm.
there. But so far, I don't think, have we seen him attack or fight any Israelite soldiers up to this point?
No, no, he said he
Yeah.
had, but he hasn't.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
even before, when Saul was coming after him, he always was running. He never, that I can remember at least,
yeah,
turned and fought, and maybe killed a few of Saul's guys and then kept on running. It was always
yeah,
kind of a pure pacifist take. So if
yeah,
he's even in dire situations avoided killing any people of Israel up to this point, I would have been surprised if he did. I think he's being deceptive here, as we've seen him be deceptive to Achish leading up to this point.
yeah. I mean, there's the possibility of this being the good old long con, and he's been stringing Achish along all this time. The thing that makes me like shy away from that a little bit is the inclusion of Yahweh in Akish's own statement. It just that seems to be very purposeful in the historical record. I think that you know, at the very least, you keep in the back of your mind the uh, the effect of dwelling in a place where you're really not supposed to dwell for for this period of time. I mean, Ziklag is supposed to be the city that he ends up getting from Achish is supposed to be one of the cities of Judah. I didn't point that out before, but I mean, it's one of the places listed in Joshua that they're supposed to get. So providentially, God finds a way for Judah to get what Judah was supposed to get through this exchange between Achish and David. But I mean, it's just yeah, it's a funny one. It's a hard one for me to I feel like it's one of those places where you'd really like for the historian to have stepped in and gone, but actually, like, he was intending this. And what is also telling is the fact that he doesn't go on to join the Hebrew effort. Now, granted, he has good reason why he doesn't, because of what has happened in Ziklag at this point. But still, yeah, just interesting. And I wanted to pose that as a dilemma. I like
And
to.
perhaps using the word providence as well. Perhaps it's providential that
Oh
God just
yeah,
keeps him out of the conflict now. That
yeah,
either side he would have been an issue,
yeah.
and so he's just not doesn't end up getting involved in the battle. Um,
I definitely see at the very least that that God has gotten him out of this jam that he's created for himself. But yeah, different reflections, and it's always good with history, in the absence of commentary, to pause and think about those things. Um, so first Samuel 30, David does deliver his Philistine dwelling. David delivers dwelling. I like the alliteration there, so I had to do it. Um, remember, David had been given the city of Ziklag by Achish. We already said that. David and his men returned to Ziklag, though, to find that it had been ransacked by Amalek, which we're going to follow kind of the ironic um, things that happened with the Amalekites here. Is what was supposed to happen with the Amalekites?
Same thing as all the other people of the land.
Well, in particular, because we have that account in 1 Samuel 15 where Saul was specifically tasked with utterly destroying the Amalekites. We got the indication that that was partial from that reading, and maybe more partial than we were led to believe even then, because you find Amalek has been active here, and Amalek has been is and Amalekite's going to come up later on in our evening together. But anyway. The Amalekites have attacked Ziklag. They've carried off several people as captives. It's a very common thing to happen in that day and age. Something that God hates, though, the idea of carrying off people into slavery. That's seemingly what's going to happen with those women and children that have been taken from Ziklag. David and the others weep. They assess what is lost, and so you have this record of David's wives being also having been taken away. He deals with mentally both with detractors and his own depression. So in verse 6, it says that he's greatly distressed, and the people are speaking about stoning him and all that. But he strengthened himself in the Lord, and so um, we haven't seen this in a little while, and maybe that's part of the moral dilemma of 1 Samuel 29, the David pausing and asking God, because that's the one thing that we don't see happening there in chapter 29 when he's lining up with the Philistine soldiers, is any record of him having paused to ask God, God, what should I do today? Should I be going with the Philistines off to battle the Hebrews? We don't see that record, but we do see him doing it here. He stops and he asks the question, should I pursue the Amalekites? And the Lord tells him that that is what he is in fact supposed to do. He's supposed to go and recover all. And in fact, he's promised that he will recover all without fail. So David gives chase to the enemy. 200 of his troops are evidently so exhausted that they can't continue the journey. And so they stay behind with the supplies, while the remainder of the 400 go on to try to find the enemy. David, in the course of trying to find the Amalekites, he's chasing after, kind of the jumping at shadows kind of thing, but not really that, but more like chasing shadows, I guess. He doesn't know where they are, but he finds a malnourished Egyptian who is one of the slaves of the Amalekites and happened to be a part of the raiding party that attacked Ziklag. After reviving him, he finds out all that. And then he agrees to, the Egyptian says, well, if you won't return me my master, if you won't punish me, then I'll show you where the Amalekites are. And so David says, deal. He finds them, he defeats them, covers everything, and even gains more in the process of all of that. And so as they return, they meet the soldiers who had been too tired to join them with some, the text identifies with some wicked and worthless individuals saying that they didn't fight and therefore they shouldn't receive any of the spoil. So why does that suggestion, you think, arise from wicked and worthless people? And what does that say about it and thoughts like it that we might be tempted to have ourselves?
I mean, it's the classic make sure that other people get less so I can get more tactic, right? If we
Self-serving.
can, yeah, that if we can find a reason to belittle someone else's contribution and act as if they're unimportant, then there's more of the slice of the pie for me.
Yeah.
Um, which then, since it's this wicked worthless, then we can presume that the righteous and worthy thing would be to respect the contributions of those who did the best they could, and did what jobs were within the limits of their abilities that they
Yeah.
managed.
Yeah. And the attitude of the wicked and worthless is that it is almost like the mercenaries as opposed to what David is trying to craft and what he will go on to craft, which is an army of brethren. This is when this kind of thing arises, in the gospel accounts, doesn't, I think in particular about, when Peter gets told that he is going to suffer martyrdom in John 21, and immediately he looks over at John and says, what about him? Like what's going to happen to him? We so often can be thinking about others who have we perceive that we've gotten a raw deal and they've gotten the blessing that we should have gotten, or gotten a blessing that they don't deserve. And that's thinking from a carnal mindset rather than thinking from the idea of being gracious and loving. And so there's a lot that we can perhaps draw from that, as well as what we see David do. Well, David validates the work of those people who had protected the supplies. That was something that needed to be done. So that even though, yes, they didn't pursue the enemy, and yes, they probably needed a rest, there was something that they did meanwhile. And he promises them an equal share. And that's going to be something that's characteristic of his kingdom going forward. In verse 25, it becomes a statute and ordinance in Israel to this day. And all the more our nation's strong when people learn how to share. The early church's, one of its hallmarks in Acts chapter 2 is its ability to share with one another. And so it's greed that says what's mine is mine. Even though it seems like it's perfectly appropriate to do that, if there's need or if there's ability to bless others, then we should be willing to say what's mine is yours or what's mine is ours. David sent some of the spoils also to his fellow tribesmen in Judah, and I think I've got a lot of discussion questions coming up. So, do you see it like if you feel compelled to comment on this, you can. What wisdom do you see in these decisions, and what can we learn?
Well, one thing that I see that's good, as opposed to what's been going on, is what we've seen him among the Philistines do is at least try to avoid harming any Jews, any people of Israel.
Yeah,
But we've not seen him, you know, as a man who has been anointed, who's meant to be king in the future. We've not
yeah,
seen him reaching out to the people who are supposed to be his eventually. So here we can at
yeah,
least see like and well, it is limited to his own tribe. Um, it is a reaching out to his people, to God's people, and kind of maybe forming connections there. I
yeah,
don't know if, just a thing that wandered through my mind as I was saying that is, perhaps he is looking forward to the time now. Um, and perhaps this event even has made him start thinking about when he'll need to go back to
yeah,
Israel, and he's starting to perhaps lay some groundwork for that, so he doesn't come in as a hello David, you've been gone for however, because he doesn't know how long it's going to be, right? You've been gone for 20 years. Who were you
yes,
again? Why should we care?
yeah.
Um, so
So
perhaps there's some of that going on.
yeah, I think he genuinely wanted to help others, and um, this is Judah is on the front lines of this battle, so they no doubt the people in these cities have kind of borne the brunt of Israel being at war with the Philistines all this time. So he's blessing some appropriate people, and he's also paving the way, like you said, perhaps for his return. A lot of wisdom in what he does here.
We also see this is, as you said, the first time in a while we've run into him speaking to God and getting advice, instruction on battles. So this victory can be laid directly at the feet of God,
Yeah,
uh, by uh, David, as it should be. And so perhaps that's got him thinking more about the people of God, as well as he's perhaps becoming more reconnected with God, who he might have been a little bit distant with over in the more Philistine area.
yeah. So at this point, we are going to start reflecting upon where there are cross references available. At First Samuel 31 is where First Chronicles starts to overlap. The material starts to overlap, and I'll try to point out, in fact, on the slides going forward, where that overlap takes place. And we get a little bit more detail in the Chronicles record, and so I've made comment on that rather than choosing to make comment on First Samuel 31. I don't do that very often, but in any event, good to know that these are now concurrent, kind of records. The records are concurrent in what they're trying to cover, not necessarily that they were written at the same time for the same purpose. But anyway, Saul commits suicide in the course of his battle with his armor bearer as Israel suffers defeat at the hands of the Philistines. He's wounded, and he rather than have the enemy that classic kind of Abimelech thing that we saw back in the book of Judges. I don't want the honor to go to the wrong person. I want my death to be in my hands. And so he takes out gets a sword and falls on his sword, and his armor bearer does the same. And um, also on top of that, we find that his sons died. Mentions here, that three of his sons actually died. So to kind of set the record for what we were going to see in the future, Saul does have actually four sons. And then there's a little bit of name fun that goes on with one of them that makes it a bit confusing. So the Abinadab of the text is Ishui or Jishui or Ishvi. It's not, there's one One of those names that just defies being spelled, evidently, for the variations that you see in translation. But then another of his sons is Eshbal or Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth was going to come up in our record in 2 Samuel very soon, and he's not dead. So Israel flees, and Saul's corpse is desecrated by the conquering Philistines. Kind of what he was afraid was going to happen while he was alive. It happens while he's dead. And Jabesh Gilead mourns the very terrible way that Saul dies. And as David will point out later, as rightly they should. The Chronicle gives a little bit of an explanation for Saul's death that I thought was worth noting in verses 13 and 14. So Saul died for his unfaithfulness, which he had committed against the Lord, because he did not keep the word of the Lord, and also because he consulted a medium for guidance. If even up into his visit to that spirit medium there, and it seems like his case was still open. And once he goes and does that, he really has crossed the paths to the other side. And I think we talked about the significance of that meal that he has with that spirit medium woman, and signifies a real passing of his fellowship. Not the Lord's table any longer that he's sitting at, but really at the table of demons. So, 2 Samuel. All right, any questions or thoughts about that closing?
I always speak up and interrupt you if I've got a passing thought.
All right, no worries. All right, so 2 Samuel, jumping in. Here we go. David, text opens up with David learning of the death of Saul. And so David receives the news of the death of Saul, along with some fabrications about how that happened, from none other than an Amalekite, which again, significance of Saul's. Now, the Amalekite does take away Saul's crown, and that kind of lends credence to his lying story. What's significant about his crown being removed by an Amalekite? Kind of already said it, but why is that significant?
I mean, there should have, if he had done his job as king, there should have been no Amalekites to remove the crown.
He's kind of lost his crown because there are Amalekites. There were other things that he had done before then, obviously, but that represented a real departure, a willing disobedience of God's commands in 1 Samuel 15, as we talked about.
To abstract it to the symbolic level, it's Saul literally lost his crown to his failures.
Yeah.
And his disobedience.
Absolutely. So David receives the news, surprisingly, to the Amalekite with sorrow, and deals out justice to the messenger. So the Amalekite is killed. Thanks for telling me about this, and now your blood is on your own head. Verse 16. And that's it. He struck him that he died. David composes, I guess, what you can call an elegy, sometimes called, though, the Song of the Bow, in verses 17 through 27. Now, why does he compose an elegy when now the pathway to the throne is open for him?
Wasn't the way he wanted it to happen.
Wasn't the way he wanted it to happen, and again, in spite of the moral ambiguity that we saw in 1 Samuel 30, judging from the rest of what we've seen him say, what was his attitude towards Saul and his kingship?
Enduring respect, both for Saul and, perhaps even more to the God who placed him on that throne.
Yep. So we this is the utmost sign of respect, and getting to think about these songs that are sung at times when justice has been dealt. And if God could sing a song about Tyre through the prophet Ezekiel, its destruction, then maybe we should be a little bit more sad when even the worst leaders meet their end. We learn from the prophets that we shouldn't rejoice when people that are wicked perish. But then I think we also learn a message about actually caring that they've done so. The Song of the Bow, you'll not see bow in the English Standard Version. Thanks for just deleting that. But the use of or the song of is added by a lot of translations. Probably the song of is the best of those understandings because it does seem like poetry that follows. It's also written in the book of Jasher. It's our first reference to that, the book of the upright. But as to what that book is or where it is, we don't know. Israel's ruler has fallen. It should not be a time of rejoicing. Gilboa, which is was mourning for his death. They should do so because Saul died as a common soldier. The shield of the mighty is cast away there. The shield of Saul, not anointed with oil. He died. He died. He didn't get a special death or any pomp or ceremony. Saul and Jonathan were great warriors for Israel and deserved to be mourned as though they were. And Jonathan, in particular, was very dear to David. So he says at the close of this, how the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war perished. I think, it's hard to say, whether that translation has been influenced by something or whether that translation influences things. Certainly how the mighty have fallen is a pretty common saying. 2 Samuel 2, David becomes king, and Israel divides over this fact. So David is anointed king, as after having inquired from the Lord, he does go up to Hebron, and he is anointed there. But while that's happening, and while he's speaking to the men of Jabesh Gilead, because of the kindness that they've shown in burying Saul, meanwhile, Ishbosheth is also anointed as king. So we've seen Abner before. He was sleeping nearby Saul and got made fun of by David because David got close enough to take the spear and the water jug away from Saul. And so none other than Abner is still around, and he's still the commander of an army that's loyal to Saul's house. And he takes advantage of that opportunity, of the opportunity presented by that to make Ishbosheth king. So we're going to start paying a little bit more attention to some of these names and people. We talked about how dates aren't so important, but it's good to know the people involved. Abner is the captain of the host under Saul, and he is also Saul's cousin, which I don't know that we made a big point of that before, but that explains a little bit of why he has a vested interest in the family of Saul continuing in royalty. Well, the rest of the text of this chapter shows a civil war, kind of following. It plays out in interesting ways. I don't really like what I see on either side here in verses 13 through 16. Civil war is always ugly, but to have you have Abner on one side here, you have Joab, and we're going to see later Abishai on the other side, and Abner and Joab say, well, let's just have the young fellas fight each other, and that'll settle matters. And so they send these guys to fight each other, and then they just basically, it's a 0-all draw every time they're fighting each other. And so you got 12 guys dead on one side, 12 guys dead on the other side. That it plays out that they kill each other every time, and it's just it feels kind of icky, as you're reading the account. The rest of the troops though pick up a fight at that point, and Abner runs away. Asahel catches up with him, and Abner kills him. Now, because I'm going to ask you about this later, we'll point out that Abner, as he's being pursued, he says, are you Asahel? And he says, I am. And Abner says, you need to stop following me. And Asahel refuses to do that, verse 21. And then verse 22, Abner says again, you stop following me, or I'm going to strike you down to the ground. Abner's a pretty tough dude, and it's not an empty threat and yet he refuses to do that. And so Abner actually says that he struck him in the stomach with a blunt end of the spear. You know, I don't know if he was trying to kill him with that, but he's so strong. The spear comes out his back, and he falls down dead on the spot. And so that's that. And um, the Joab and Abishai continue to continue to fight. Abner until Abner reasons with them and says, "When's this going to end? You know, like we're just fighting each other, we're killing each other. Um, shall the sword devour forever?" Verse 26 is a good question, and you know, so he reasons with them, and eventually that kind of leads things to die down. Abner retreats and both evaluate the losses. Joab has only lost 20 men. So clearly the battle seems to be going in their favor. Abner's lost 360 in in turn. So again, more success on the side that's defending Joab's side in spite of its moral shortcomings. So Joab, again, another key character here, the captain of the host, which is kind of like, well, I guess it's like the main general or whatever, if you want to call it that. Their military doesn't rank up like our military does in the same ways, but there is a stratification to it. David had like the man, and then the 3, and then the 30, and he's got these various tiers to his military, just like we have in ours today, in terms of tiers, but not in terms of the same kinds. Abishai is another character again that's noteworthy. He's one of David's 5 greatest warriors after Joab, a member of the 30-strong group called the Mighty Men, which 2 Samuel 23 will praise, and we'll talk about that in future class. So in 2 Samuel 3, David's power grows. He dwells in Hebron. His family grows, has children. Ishbosheth, though, meanwhile, gets angry at Abner for taking Saul's concubine. So Abner, in spite of him being a very strong man, isn't a very good man. So and the significance of this, keep in the back of your mind when we get to David and Absalom. When you're taking somebody else's concubines, you're making a big statement in this day and time. So Ishbosheth may be the one sitting on the throne, but Abner's really the one who's setting himself up to be the power, at least behind the throne, and maybe one day the power on the throne. So Abner, at this point, with Ishbosheth, maybe he's saying,
Hello.
You're more trouble than you're worth. Hey, Joey, welcome. So we're in 2 Samuel chapter 3 now. We're talking about Abner and the civil war that existed after David was crowned king. Ishbosheth was also crowned king, and the one who's done that, Abner, is about to defect and go over to David's side. So that's where we are, and we'll pick up with that. So he says, amongst the things that you might not immediately identify here in the reading here, in a dog's head that belongs to Judah. A dog is a contemptible animal in this day and time. That doesn't change very much when Jesus comes around, and you have that account where the woman from the Canaanite background asks to receive help from Jesus, and we're going to give our food to the dogs, kind of thing. What's meant for the children to the dogs, and the woman asked for the scraps. It was a test of her, and the reason it's a test is because of, again, how people perceive dogs in this time. So Abner contacts David, seeking peace, but David says that he will not accept him until he gets his wife back. So we kind of have maybe forgotten at this point that David, who was he married to, that was involved in Saul's family?
Oh, was it Uriah?
No.
I know this one, but I can't remember.
Can't remember her name right now, but it is Saul's daughter.
Yeah, Saul's
Yeah.
daughter, Michal. Michal.
McCall.
Yep. So, yeah, so David hasn't forgotten her, even though we might have forgotten her. And he wants his wife back. And so, Michal is that woman, Saul's daughter, given to David as a wife. She saved David's life, if you remember, when he fell out of favor with Saul, and then Saul gave her to another man illegally. So that's filling you in a little bit on her backstory. I've been pointing out a few more of our characters here in Second Samuel, Joey, because we're gonna have a lot of names flying around here, and so
Yeah.
when you
I
when
just
you
got some noisy sisters.
yeah, that's all right. So but just you might have to go back and review this, but I'm probably going to be asking a little bit more about character identification on our upcoming final. So getting back to the plot, Michal is restored to David, and Abner works to sway the loyalties of the people to David, as you expect him to do at this point, given that he's defected to his side. He speaks, obviously, so in front of the elders of Israel. He speaks also to the people of Benjamin, which is Saul's home. That's his home tribe, and so trying to sway their hearts. And it says Abner went out to speak in the hearing of David in Hebron, all that seemed good to Israel and the whole house of Benjamin. So he's winning the war of public opinion. So David throws a feast for Abner and his men. The two of them find peace together, as it says in verse 21. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. But Joab returns from a raiding party just as Abner leaves and is told about Abner's visit. He is not happy to hear that, and he tries to convince David that Abner was just spying on him. Without David's support, he calls Abner back and he kills him. So that's one of those that escalated quickly kind of things. So David's reaction is recorded in verses 28 through 30. He's very upset by what Joab has done. He pronounces a curse on Joab's house. Now, remember I said this was going to come up. So what's the difference between Abner killing Asahel and Joab killing Abner? Now, you missed that first part, Joey. Maybe Nicholas, you can help with that first part. So again, how did Abner kill Asahel?
Essentially,
Stab him or like betray him?
No, you missed that part, like I said. So if you haven't read it and don't remember it, you gotta let somebody else answer.
You did get the stabbing half right there, though. Stabbed with a blunt implement, which seems like it would be worse. Stabbed with the end of the spear, and
Yeah.
he only killed him kind of at the limits. He tried to avoid it within reason, given a battle and men trying to kill each other on opposite sides.
Yeah, he gave him 2 warnings to stop following me. You're gonna get yourself hurt. And then again he hits him with the butt end of his spear, which typically, that's not going to kill anybody unless you're a big tough dude like Abner was. And the butt end of his spear is what goes through Asahel and kills him. Now the difference between that is, and this is night and day. In verse 28. Rather, let me go back to the actual count of the murder. So where is that at? And it says, now, verse 27, when Abner had returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gate to speak with him privately. Come over here, let's talk about something. And there stabbed him in the stomach so that he died for the blood of Asahel, his brother. So this is one, it's a revenge murder. Asahel is revealed to be Joab's brother there. 2, it's done under the pretense of talking to him, and it's sneaky. I could be wrong here, but I remember the old King James. I think I think it does it here too. Like the old fifth rib. There's this joke about getting stabbed in the fifth rib, and it's kind of like he's getting stabbed in his side when it says his stomach. It's like he's leaned in and talking to him, and he stabs him. So it's very sneaky, and you can see why David is upset, and why even though Joab is on his side, he's not happy with him. David mourns over the death of Abner, and he begins to distance himself from the tactics of some of his warriors, such as Joab. And so he's these men are too harsh for me, he says in verse 39. All right, questions about 2 Samuel 3?
There's also the aspect, just to add to the litany of sins here with this killing, is that he's spoken to his commander, Joab has spoken to his commander, David, about what should be done about Abner. And David has told him, no, leave Abner alone.
Yeah.
He's proven himself. He's done work for us. He's done what he's told us to do. I've accepted him. He's on our team now. Play nice.
Yeah.
And just in direct defiance of thing is, I'll get my hands dirty so you don't have to. And David is, no one had to get their hands dirty here.
Yeah, right.
It's trying to do what was best for us while completely going against what I actually wanted you to do.
Yeah, and it really wasn't best because even though Abner is he's no white knight, he's not a by any means a really good guy, but at the same time he has been working to win people over to the side of David and to end this conflict peacefully. Well, Ishbosheth is still, though, at least nominally in the eyes of some king. So what happens to him? 2 Samuel 4, you can see that he is going to be murdered. Ishbosheth learns of Abner's death. The writer at this point pauses to describe the condition of Saul's house and his allies. Things are just falling apart, as you might have guessed. Although the text does point out this little detail in verse number 4. Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son who was lame in his feet. He was 5 years old when news came about Saul and Jonathan from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And as it happened, she made haste to flee. He fell and became lame, and his name is Mephibosheth. So you'll remember that name. It will pop up later. Anyway, the two allies of Saul ended up killing Ishbosheth and taking taking his head, rather, to King David. Well, how's David going to respond to this? We've seen before that when the Amalekite came with Saul's crown, and that wasn't really well received by David. Well, this is not very well received by David either. He says he reminds the two men of what he did to the one who claimed to have killed Saul. He's like, you guys brought me this guy's head. And didn't you hear about how I put to death the guy who said he killed Saul? So David sees the death of Ishbosheth as being worse than the death of Saul's, because Ishbosheth hasn't done what Saul has done to warrant any kind of ill treatment. There's no record of him having done the things that Saul did, and so he believes that they are worthy of having an even harsher punishment. And so it says David commanded his young men, and they executed them, cut off their hands and feet, and hanged them by the pool in Hebron. And so all of that intentionally quite shameful in the way that they die. And so both painful and shameful. So that's chapter 4. And then chapter 5. David becomes king over all of Israel. I didn't point this out before I did point this out before in the recording, but for Joey's sake, who's joining us, we're trying to point out now at 1 Samuel 31, the record of 1 Chronicles starts to overlap with the history here. And so where there are concurrent, or what's the word I'm looking for? I've used that word before. That's not the right word. where there are parallel passages, I guess you can say, between Second Samuel and First Chronicles. I'm trying to point that out for your benefit. And there's a good tool, by the way, that helps with that. It's an old tool, and you may even find a free version on the internet. I can't say that I have looked because I have little doubt, but that this is out of copyright now. It's quite old, and but this little guy here. So this is a harmony of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. It's by William Day Crockett. It's so old that it uses this kind of defunct translation to do its kind of parallel, accounting. I think it's like the revised version or something like that. Some old translation that's not used very much anymore. But you can see what it does. It's kind of like a little bit like the Fourfold Gospel, if you have that, by McGarvey. It has just the places where I shouldn't say it's like that, because it's actually not like that in the Fourfold Gospel, if I remember right. Actually kind of weaves it all together into one account. Whereas this, you have columns where there are parallels, as you can see. But anyway, it's a tool, and helps to make, making those comparisons a little bit more easy. I think it's been a while since I went through and did what I'm showing you here on this. There may have been a time where I disagreed with something. I feel like there was, but overall, a pretty good resource. Anyway, the leaders of the 12 tribes in 2 Samuel 5, they acknowledge David as ruler over Israel. David's reign is going to last a total of 40 years, we are told, kind of proleptically. Prolepsis is where you get told something before it happens, and so you kind of get this almost summation statement here of David's reign before it's even kind of really gotten underway. And so we're told that he's going to reign for 40 years, including the 7.5 he's already spent in Hebron at this point. In picking a place where he's going to have a capital, Jerusalem makes an ideal spot. But currently it's inhabited by the Jebusites. Now we've seen conflict with the Jebusites before, but Israel defeated them before, but they never drove them out during the time of Joshua. And so here they are again. And so David is going to do what had not been previously done. He marches against Jerusalem. He took the city, even though the inhabitants really thought that he couldn't. You shall not come in here, verse 6, but the blind and the lame will repel you, they said. Well, David showed them in pretty short order that that wasn't the case. He gives his warriors incentive to fight, rewards for valor, and payback for insults. Whoever climbs up the way of the water shaft and defeats the Jebusites, he shall be chief and captain. And so there's promotions available, and not to mention the fact that they've insulted us. David inhabits the city and becomes so great that Tyre offers gifts of peace. Hiram, the king of Tyre, will play prominently in David's life, as well as in the life of his son Solomon and in the construction of the temple. It's notable. I've been talking about teaching Ezekiel at the same time as we're going through this book together. And it's notable that Ezekiel, kind of has a lot of material about Tyre in particular, and which shouldn't be surprising when you see how often Tyre kind of creeps up in the text here. David takes his first step away from God's pattern. We've seen this before, but really the attention is drawn to it here. He multiplies his wives. He had a few before. He's got more now, and several that we just don't even recognize at all. In addition to the ones clearly that we have previously been named, and this is something again that according to Deuteronomy 17:17, in that picture of the ideal king of God's people was not supposed to do. From this point forward, the details are actually ordered differently in Chronicles than in Samuel from time to time, and so you're going to see more jumping around in the chapters of the Chronicles as we compare them. We'll be following Second Samuel for the most part, but you just note that that's what's happening, and you can kind of see that to a degree there, right? Like First Chronicles 11, then First Chronicles 14 as the text that parallels Second Samuel 5. So, but that's going to happen a little bit more moving forward. So, as the chapter comes to a conclusion, David defends against the Philistines. Up until this point, there's kind of been probably a bit of peace between him and them, perhaps because of his time spent among them. But the Philistines heard of David becoming king over all Israel and decided to bring troops against him. That was kind of their go-to tactic. We'll just when in doubt, fight it out. So they go to fight Saul, they go to fight David, and David is doing what we've seen him do. He stops and asks God, should I go against the Philistines? Will you deliver them to my hand? And the Lord says to that, yes and yes. And so he's told to go out and attack them. And so David does so, and he wins just like God said he would. The place where this battle takes place is Baal Perazim. Literally, the Lord breaks through. And so and if you're wondering there, the Lord, not capital Lord, Yahweh, Baal, though it's associated with the false god Baal. It's just the Hebrew word for Lord, and so it's not necessarily a bad word. In fact, God Himself will use the word Baal at times. If you were to look at the language behind the translation in reference to Himself. So anyway, the Lord breaks through. Baal can refer to an idol, but it can also refer to any Lord, including God. Think of it as though a little bit more toxic of a word than Adonai. It's not, like too far off of that, or the Kyrios of the New Testament. So the Philistines regroup. They attack again. David once again consults God, who tells him to attack from the rear after being given a sign that He is with them, and he does that and drives them back. And there's 2 Samuel 5. Feel like we're cruising. There's not really a lot that's like super not straightforward about these first 5 chapters here. There's some. I find this part of history very interesting. But at the same time, nothing too like pause for thought, kind of if that makes sense. But we're going to get a little bit of a squirrely one when we come back and look at 2 Samuel chapter 6 and do a little bit more thinking than we've done with our text up to this point. So let's prepare for that. And in the meantime, let's go ahead and pause and take a little bit of a break. And we are back. So picking up with 2 Samuel chapter 6, as I said, first 5 chapters of 1 Samuel, interesting, but not necessarily the hardest to kind of work our way through in terms of moral difficulties and dilemmas. Well, here we are in 2 Samuel 6, where David is now trying to restore the Ark of God to the tabernacle. Well, that's great. The last time we saw the Ark of God, it had kind of come out of the Philistine territory and came to rest in was it Kirjath Jearim or wherever it was, and so the idea is that we're now going to get it where it ought to be. Well, there's a problem, as we're going to see with that whole plan. Now, I will say, even though we won't be following this record for the sake of our study, the account of this event is much more detailed in the Chronicles. You can see that in terms of chapter material, but it's also in terms of the actual content of those chapters. So if you want more details on the return of the Ark, look at 1 Chronicles 13 and then also 15 and 16. But meanwhile, in 2 Samuel chapter 6, David decides to go fetch the forgotten Ark of the Covenant and bring it to Jerusalem in the first couple of verses. And so we're kind of consolidating rule, getting things right again. And part of that is getting the Ark of the Covenant back where it ought to be. Well, they begin to transport the Ark of the Covenant with great fanfare. David is not someone who kind of just barely does things. If he does it, he goes all out. And so there's great fanfare. But then they place the ark on a cart, which ignores God's instructions for how the ark was supposed to be transported. But whose practices does that actually mirror?
People who returned it with golden lumps and mice.
Right. So the Philistines, when they sent the ark back to Israel, they put it on a cart. And so really David's, for all the fanfare, at its heart, he's doing something that mirrors, more mirrors the world than it does mirror what the faithful of God are supposed to do. And I think that there is already something to be paused and thought about even before we see the outcome. That when we strip back the fanfare, what really is happening sometimes in modern worship. I remember one time when I was in Guyana, South America, in the city of Lethem. They had a Bible college there that I was teaching at, and on Sundays I would preach for the local church there while I was there for like the 3 weeks that I was there. And Sunday morning got up and came to find out that what the neighbor was not too enthusiastic about the Lord's church having moved in next door, and he was a denominational individual and wanted everybody to know that. And so what he would do is he would blast his Christian so-called music, with the instrumental music involved. And one song that he loved to listen to that I came to despise was a song that said over and over again, with instrumental fanfare throughout, "We're getting back to the heart of worship. It's all about you. It's all about you." And that got repeated about 100 times in that song. And I might be exaggerating just a little bit, or it could be like 97 or something, but like just over and over again, all about you. It's all about you. And and so it's well, I mean, if it is, then take back all the fanfare, peel back the theatrics of the whole thing, the way it sounds, what really is at the heart of this. And again, the way that singer was carrying on, and the audience, the way the audience was, I was listening to recordings, and it was a live recording, but I didn't see the video or anything, but I'm sure they were quite entranced and enraptured with all the lights and things that were happening as a part of this song. And you peel that back and look at it, looks a lot like a Taylor Swift concert. Maybe that guy's probably wearing more clothes than she does, but the fanfare, the theatrics, the presence of instruments and all of that. I mean, well, what is it? And so already we're being given pause for thought, and we'll definitely be given more as the text continues. The oxen stumble as they are transporting this ark, and Uzzah, who's been walking alongside of this and seemingly one of the key individuals involved with the transportation here, and he touches the ark to steady it, and immediately he is struck dead. It says in verse 7 that the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his error, and he died there by the ark of God. Uzzah's death greatly angers David, and he calls the place the outburst against Uzzah. The outbreak is how it's rendered in the text of the New King James, but outburst in the margin, or the rent of Uzzah, as Keelan Delich, kind of graphically translated. Question is, why did Uzzah die? Why did Uzzah die? Seems like a pretty practical thing to do if you see something falling, to try to reach out and steady it.
I mean, the most basic reason is there was law, there was commandment against touching the ark. That's why it had the poles that were supposed to stay permanently, in place in it and not be removed from the rings, because it was never to be picked up and moved by anything but those poles, and then only by specific, members of the priestly caste.
So at the very least, he had set aside the commandments of God, along with the others. Maybe the question then could also be, why did he die and not the others? So feel free to answer that, or maybe the follow-up question of why else did he die?
Yeah. We do see God in these times of transition making examples, being harsh on those who are standing out as, examples of what not to do and how things are not going to get going. You think about the start of the church and
Ananias and Sapphira.
yes, sorry, I was remembering Sapphira and I couldn't remember husband's name. Yeah, where that's quite a harsh punishment to be struck dead by, for a deception that probably wasn't terribly uncommon in the history of the church overall. So why are they singled out and uniquely punished in this very, very quick and very obvious way in front of everyone, struck down by God? Well, my take on the matter is that it is a setting of the tone and an enforcing of what is important as we're getting started here. That this is not how we're going to say it. You also go to Moses and the sons of Aaron, and they're at the very start, the very first sacrifices at the tabernacle, and God striking them down because this is not how we're going to start. This is not how this renewal, this new page of the chapter is going to begin. It's going to begin with people doing things the right way, and God is going to take action to enforce that lesson.
Yeah.
Why he doesn't strike down more? Well, we see that, Uzzah here is the one who actually touches the ark. We don't know how they loaded the ark, presumably with the poles. If no one else is lifted up by those, I don't know. Again, we're not really told that. I don't believe.
It is interesting.
And maybe God didn't want to strike down the entire caravan of however many people, including David, who was part of the whole thing. But he does make the example of the person who goes the farthest in the disobedience there.
Yeah, it's when the Lord, I mean, I'll definitely there is sort of a beginning that's happening here. David, Civil War's over. David is kind of beginning his kingship in earnest. Even though he's been king now for 7 odd years, he's still not been the king of all of Israel. And so there's something that needs to be solidified about God's place in all of this at this point. But I think that one of the things that sometimes when we have these discussions we don't think about enough is that God sees the heart of Uzzah, and clearly there is something present in his heart that's a little bit worse than the heart sets or the mindsets of those around him. And when God can, we can look at this and be like, well, if Uzzah had just been given another chance, isn't God one who gives, other chances to people when that has profit? I mean, the Lord is not willing that any should perish. And so sometimes we think that people are that God's not in a position to know whether people are redeemable or not. And I think that's something that needs to at least be somewhere in our thought process as we try to process things like this. That really, we know enough about God to know that he would have been and is merciful where he can be. So I think that's part of the answer. I like it when we reflect upon questions like this and we try to be as nuanced as possible and think about as many different things as possible. So right. I think that there's, and I think that in terms of, what is he thinking at that moment that sees him stick out his hand? I need to help this thing. God's not present there at all at that moment. This isn't the work of God. This isn't an act of service to God and transporting it. We're not taking it back to the temple of the tabernacle of the living God. We're transporting an expensive box, and it's that really all it is to us at that point as he sticks out his hand. So there's a lot that goes on there, because it does seem, like I said, very practical thing to do, except for and it's a big exception, except for God. If this weren't God's ark, and if it weren't something that was governed by His ways, then it'd be an entirely different story, I'm sure. Well, fearing the ark at this point, he gets angry at first, but then he gets scared, and he says, "Well, let's just stop." And he orders it to be stored in the house of Obed-Edom, a Levite, thankfully, from Gath Rimmon, in verses 9 and 10. Because the ark is cared for by the right person, a Kohathite priest, those were the ones who were supposed to bear up the ark and transport it. God blesses Obed-Edom, and that causes David to change his mind when he sees that this really isn't a bad thing. I've just handled it a bad way. And David learns his lesson regarding the ark. And meanwhile, if we were to go over to the record of the Chronicles, he also restores the tabernacle, which has now been in operation for a couple hundred years. I don't try to date the the book of Judges, but there's been some distance between the wilderness wanderings and here, to say the least. And so it's just time for things to be cared for, and David is certainly a man who wants to do that. So the ark is returned, and David, we get another squirrely issue here. David is so excited about this. It says in verse 15, so David and all the house of Israel, well, let me go back for this in verse 14. David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. I don't know that we need to necessarily worry about the ephod there, in as much as I just don't get any sense that from anything that happens after that, that there's any issue with that, even though we've seen that word be problematic previously. It's probably just a garment at this point. David, though, it says, and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting, with the sound of the trumpet. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and whirling before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. So, what's happening here? Well, here's the way that Keelan DeLitch handled this, and I think there's some worthy thoughts here. In Saul's time, people did not trouble themselves about the Ark of the Covenant, clearly. Public worship was neglected, and the soul for vital religion had died out in the family of the king. In other words, we have a saying here about our political parties. There, in terms of the Republicans, there are Republicans, and then there are rhinos. A rhino is a Republican in name only. The household of Saul are followers of God in name only. Really, there's not a lot happening there. I don't doubt Jonathan's heart, but outside of Jonathan and clearly in this daughter, there's just not a lot there. And we kind of scratched our heads. I hope I remember to do this back in 1 Samuel 19. How she had that image or whatever it was that she used to trick people. The people who came to kill David. She put the image, it says, in her bed. The word teraphim, which is typically a word that follows idolatry. Possible that that's the case for her. Anyway, in David, she only loved the brave hero and the exalted king. She therefore took offense at the humility with which the king, in his pious enthusiasm, placed himself on equality with the rest of all the nation before the Lord. That's probably the closest to a good explanation of her behavior in all of this. And why she despises him. Anybody else have any thoughts there, though? Thought about this before?
I see it as a little bit of the similar as they say, though, perhaps a bit less nuanced. Um, the one of the common weaknesses, because every place in life has its own weaknesses and its own struggles, and she's raised, as kind of as a royal, as the daughter of the king, that she was gifted with a lot of things, has a lot of blessings. One of the problems that can arise from that is to think that because of these blessings you have, physical blessings you have, or spiritual, from being the daughter of Saul, that she's better than, and making a mockery of yourself, being humble, not treating yourself with proper dignity is improper and something to look down your nose at. I get that it doesn't specifically say that she's looking from an upper window here, but in my mind's eye, when I'm reading through this passage, it is she's in a second floor or higher and literally looking down at the jubilant David, and it's and she's looking down on it.
And maybe on the other side of the coin, as we evaluate her behavior, I think it's probably worth asking the question: when was the last time you jumped up and down at some good news from regarding the Lord's church? It's as much as we can say how petty McCall for looking at David like that. When was the last time I had genuine excitement over something that happened at church? It's certainly just something for introspection, not necessarily you have to answer.
And of course, the verse, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Someone who is earnestly rejoicing over something that is wonderful, should be supported in that joy, not, scowled at. That's not the godly way of handling our brothers and sisters.
Yeah, even if we don't understand what's causing someone to be happy, we should be happy that they're happy. This is a man's wife. You'd expect a wife to be happy that her husband's happy. Well, David makes this whole thing a time of worship and of celebration, as the text reveals here. When it says that he had offered a sacrifice, don't worry about that. Get used to this, and I'll make mention of this later, that something that happens in historical records is that I have a little saying that helps me to remember this: what one does through another, one does. So what I do, or rather what I have someone do on my behalf, the historical records are very often, often freely attribute that behavior to me. Like I order a pizza and a delivery driver comes and brings it to me, the historical record would be very happy to say Patrick got a pizza. Well, no, Patrick didn't get a pizza. It was delivered to him by a delivery driver. Well, no, that's okay. We don't need to hammer all that out. And again, don't read anything into the fact that he's said to be wearing the linen ephod and then he's offering sacrifices. The text would definitely call attention to that at this point. If these were the kind of things that we saw like Saul doing earlier. David does, though, compose a psalm of thanksgiving to mark this occasion. 1 Chronicles 16, 7 through 42 is definitely worthy of your reflection. But conveniently, we're following the record of 2 Samuel, so we won't have a look at that. But just so you know, when David returns home, Michal and David fight over his behavior, and that's kind of it for this relationship, which really is sad when you think about the fact that this is, the Proverbs talk about the wife of your youth. This is the wife of David's youth. This is his legitimate one flesh, and yet it says that they part from each other. And Michal, it says, therefore Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death, i.e., they no longer have marital relations. All right.
And of course, because David has so many backup wives to go to, it's not as big of a deal for him. So perhaps he didn't try as hard as he could have if he was, married to one wife and had to.
Wow.
Well, I mean, it's been
Wow.
pointed out. We've already talked about how in chapter 5, he's multiplying his wives at this point, and so makes it easier to not preserve relationships when you don't have to. Well, God's promise to David is recorded in 2 Samuel 7 and also 1 Chronicles 17. David is upset. It says in chapter 7, after all this fanfare and festivities, the ark returns to the tabernacle. David has taken steps to try to beautify the tabernacle, but he looks at it at the end of the day and says, God's house is a tent, my house is a mansion. At this point, he has built a nice house for himself. He dwells in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells inside tent curtains. I tend to think that Nathan here, who he's talking to, David's talking to about this, and by the way, just again for character identification's sake, Nathan is a prophet of God during the time of David and also the early life of Solomon. He's one of the, as far as we know, oral prophets of this period. An oral prophet is a non-writing prophet, although you just wonder who ends up writing 1st and 2nd Samuel, and maybe David, maybe Nathan, maybe Gad, some of these oral prophets, maybe they had something to do with it. But anyway, before hearing anything from God, Nathan kind of gives him the thumbs up. I think as you know, we see happening in 1 Chronicles 14, just because you're a prophet doesn't mean you're always speaking a message from the Lord. 1 Chronicles, I say 1 Chronicles, 1 Corinthians 14 talks about, how a prophet could be up there speaking at church with the New Testament gift of prophecy, and prophet can be up there speaking at church, and another message is given to somebody else, and he has to sit down. Well, clearly that means that he's elaborating at that point, or talking about something that some conclusion he's reached, rather than some direct revelation from the Lord. And obviously that's subservient to God's message, and that's why he has to sit down, and the next guy gets up with God's message. But here, I think Nathan is just speaking on his own wisdom and knowing God and knowing David's heart and seeing this as a good thing. Says, yeah, go for it. But God makes it clear that this is not something that he asked for. So as a little bit of a touching base with the New Testament here, who talks about the fact that this was not something that God asked for in the New Testament?
Jesus?
It was
Paul?
Stephen. No, Stephen. So this is actually where, like, I get upset at that crowd there in Acts chapter 7, because Stephen's sermon is building up to this profound point about how the Most High doesn't dwell in temples made with hands, and God didn't really want a temple. And I would really have loved to heard the rest of that thought, but that's when he turns his attention to their hard-heartedness, and his message gets derailed, and they put him to death with stones. But there is something purposeful about God saying this, and yet, even though he says that, and even though he doesn't desire it, God does allow it. I think that while we need to caution ourselves against, being flippant or careless with what God has revealed in terms of his desires, there is room even today for well-intentioned efforts. There's a lot of debate in our brotherhood about how the money is spent. I don't know if you're aware of this in New Zealand to the degree that we are in the United States, but there is a lot of debate amongst brethren as to how money ought to be spent. And I think that there's something to be said about brethren who intend with good hearts to try to present something worthy of the Lord in what they're trying to do. I know an assembly place is an expedient. I know that we waste money on these things too often, but at the same time, I do have a little bit of sympathy in my heart for the person who really wants to just have something nice that's a part of what they're trying to do and give to God. And I used to look more harshly on those kind of things and have more of the attitude that we ought to be careful with the Lord's money and all that kind of, all that kind of rationale. But I've grown in reflecting upon this text and others like it to seeing the value of people who just really want to do something nice for God. I like it when people want to do something nice for my wife. So why not? Why should I not like it when people want to do something nice for God?
And while we see here that God didn't ask for, these certain things, that the house built of cedar and whatnot, he was very specific about the tabernacle and how it was built. And he didn't want it just to be a rough tent with a few hides thrown over it.
Yeah,
He
right.
did expect a certain amount of honor and given to it.
Yeah.
Which, is most easily reflected to people from our senses when what we can see.
Yeah.
So it's not as if he's completely, eschewing all, completely asceticism in those
Exactly.
things necessarily.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's certainly something that does tend to divide people in our brotherhood, and so worth pausing and thinking about from time to time. Nathan was to remind David of his blessings in the past, to promise that he, that is God, would make him, David, a house, not the other way around. So, David, you want to build me a house, but you need to know that that's not really what's happening here. I'm going to build you a house. The Lord tells you, at the close of verse 11, it says, the Lord tells you that he will make you a house. And so let's pause and read this text, because this is a very important text, both in this message, but then more importantly, from the New Testament point of view, a very important message in the New Testament. It gets quoted and referenced in the New Testament frequently. We need to spend a little bit of time thinking about it. So let's look at verses 12 through 14. If someone could read that, please.
So chapter 7, 12 through 14. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you. You shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, but with the stripes of the Son of Men.
All right. So, prophetic in nature. The question is, who is this about and why?
This house is nice. You don't really have to walk.
Well, to the Christian eye, obviously, we can see parallels here between some of the messianic prophecies, some of the wording here. Obviously, the literal is probably the more direct there, as far as that's the actual context of what's happening here and who he's talking about. But yeah, so there's always that question, right? All right, is this prophecy about one thing, or is it about more than one thing? If that has been known to happen, we see some of the New Testament, prophets and speakers, apostles, make reference to Old Testament prophecies, but kind of recontextualize them into the New Testament, Christian era. And so it is a bit of a conundrum there of is this just about one thing, or is it about more?
Mm-hmm. Well, when you speak about New Testament authors utilizing things, this text in particular is quoted most certainly in the New Testament, and most certainly applied to Jesus. Like there's not any real question about this particular text being messianic, but there's parts of this reading that clearly have nothing at all to do with Jesus. I mean, you look at verse 14. If he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the blows of the sons of men. I mean, Jesus doesn't need that, and God knows he doesn't need that. So I think you're right in trying to look at this text and saying, well, there's something immediate happening here, and then there's something further intended. You know, the terminology that sometimes I've heard brethren use, and I think it's not a bad way of describing this, is identifying this prophecy as a dual prophecy, not DUEL like people fighting, but DUAL like two. So if I just happen to have for some reason an old Buffalo nickel here, and you can see how a Buffalo nickel is one coin, and yet there's two very distinct different images. This is kind of a worn one, but you got a buffalo on the back, and the back, and then you've got a Native American on the front. So one coin, two images, one prophecy, two clear pictures. This text speaks about something that's going to happen when David is dead, and the person who comes from him, his seed after him, is going to build a house for my name. David is going to think, all right, the child of mine who's going to become a king, which he will later identify as Solomon, is the man that's going to build the temple for the Lord. There's no doubt in David's mind that that's what this is about. And yet, clearly, there's something a little bit more here, because God is making a connection between himself and the family of David and identifying David's son as his own. There is another cross-reference that's important to add to your reflections on this text, and that is the second Psalm. So Psalm 2. And when you read that psalm and you think about, and again, that's a psalm that's quoted in the New Testament, most certainly applied to Jesus. But what would it have meant to the person who was singing it when it was written, who had no understanding or knowledge of Jesus, and who had heard maybe Nathan or maybe even David himself declare what the Lord had said to David? I think that there is a relationship again that gets created in the minds of a lot of the Israelites between the Lord and David's family, and so they thought that there was a certain allegiance between God and David's family, and that the sons of David were God's sons. And I think that this text is actually saying that they definitely, could be. How often does God come to the aid of the house of David? And yet, the problem was that so many of those sons, the majority of those sons, the majority of people who come from David's line, are unfortunately the kind of people who cannot be established by the Lord because of their sin, and instead have to be subjected to the rod of men and the blows of the sons of men that are talked about there in verse 14. And so what could have been is always a question you ask when you're studying the Old Testament. What could have been had they been totally consistent with driving out the people from the land in the time of Joshua and the judges? What could have been had David and his family been totally and permanently convicted of the Lord and of their need to serve him? You just have to ask that question, and you just don't really know the answer. But I tend to believe that there would still be a Davidic king over Judah even to this day, over Israel even to this day, had those kings been faithful throughout the years, and had each generation took up the charge of serving God. And yet, when they change, God will not move with them from himself, or act in ways that are inconsistent with him. And he'll find a way to keep his promise here that transcends the physical Davidic line. So anyway, a lot to think about there in that reading, but definitely messianic. And again, second Psalm 2 as a text you can put in conjunction with it, and that gets quoted, and those both get quoted in the New Testament on a couple of occasions. All right. The kingdom would not come to an end, even if David's seed was chastened. It would be established forever. And this again points to that ongoing dual nature of this prophecy. Let's read this as well, verses 15 through 17.
You want to pick that one up, Joey? Yeah. Or should I do this one? All right, I'll pick it up then. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words, and in accordance with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David.
So, for those who do know the end of the story, given Jehoiakim was written off as childless and has the Lord promised that no man would sit upon, no man from his lineage would sit upon the throne and reigning in Jerusalem forever. How do you reconcile that with the statements that you find here?
Obviously, can't remember enough of the details to make a good comment on it.
It's okay. So the answer to that question lies in, again, the Bible being very specific. When we think about the throne of David, though it is true that Jehoiakim ruins it, there is no longer any king that reigns in Jerusalem, sitting upon the throne of David. That's it. But Jesus, thankfully, doesn't sit on the throne of David in Jerusalem. Instead, he sits on the throne of David in heaven. And so, while the prophecies of Jeremiah would actually keep Jesus from being a king here on this earth, Jesus never intended to be a king here on this earth, and instead he intended, of course, to be a king as God designed him to be a king in heaven. There's actually an extended kind of discussion of this idea in if you've ever heard of Foy E. Wallace by any chance. He's a Brotherhood speaker of the yesteryear. He is and quite a speaker, because his books are essentially his sermons, and the chapters are like 80, 90, 100 pages long. And so you're like, that these guys that were listening to these sermons were like listening to him for like 3 hours talk about something. And but anyway, the book where this actually gets discussed is a book called God's Prophetic Word. If you happen to find a copy of that, I think it's available online. If I can track it down, I might send you a link. But in any event, that's the long and short of that kind of issue. Yes, there will come an end to the Davidic reign in Jerusalem because of the behavior of David's household, but that doesn't mean that there's any problem with Jesus being a king. It all has to do with where the throne is. All right. So reflecting on the promise, God's desire was never really for a temple, though he allowed the Israelites to build one in the next generation, and he honored their intentions with his presence. The prophecy was actually a dual prophecy, as we've already talked about, with some elements referring to Solomon and David's fleshly descendants, and others, clearly finding their fulfillment in Jesus. It's being given the throne of his father David talked about, and being God's son is talked about in Hebrews 1:5 and so on. David didn't understand all of God's promise, as is pretty evident from the text, and that's to be expected. People didn't understand all that God was saying in this time. Well, David, though, does pray a beautiful prayer in response to this great promise. He realizes that God has not promised this because David himself deserved it, but for the sake of his word. And talks about that in the beginning of this prayer. He realizes that there is no God as great as God, and no people as blessed as Israel. And he prays for God to do just as he said he would. And with those thoughts, we find the chapter coming to an end. All right. Well, let's see here. I think we can breeze through chapter 8, and that'll give us a third of the book done. So I think I feel good about that. A couple of lists. in 2 Samuel 8, 1 through 14. We've got a list of David's victories. Just to show you that as David's kingdom progresses, things are going well. And then a list of David's officials in 2 Samuel 8, 15 through 18. As I said, we can breeze right through chapter 8. All right. What questions or comments do we have in closing?
I did that.
All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up with a word of prayer. Let's do that. Holy and glorious Father, we thank you, Father, so much for the blessing of being able to reflect upon the text today. We thank you, Father, for what we have learned and spending a little bit more time in thinking about Uzzah and also in thinking about David's behavior before he became a king and after. We thank you, God, for clearly the excitement and enthusiasm with which he wanted to serve you. And we thank you, God, for his heart in wanting to do something great and to place some real importance in the worship and service of you. But we're so thankful that even though he wanted to build you a house, that you always intended more in that tabernacle or even that temple that he, through his son Solomon, would ultimately build. We thank you, God, that you established a true throne and an eternal kingdom in what you established through Jesus Christ. We thank you for him, and we thank you that we can serve him as our King, and that we offer this in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So we will wrap up the evening. Thanks.